Hello, my name is Zachar Karecki, and this is the Transitions Visions podcast, a podcast series about and for the sustainability transitions community. In this month's episode, I talked with Jonas Torrens, who is an assistant professor at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. Jonas is the kind of person, after every conversation with whom you feel you have learned a valuable insight. And we talked about a whole range of things, among which I will probably flag some solid advice for PhD students in transition studies, especially for those who might feel uncomfortable with how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary transition studies are. So we talked about the borders between disciplines and what kind of disciplining these borders enforce, and what might be done about them. In this discussion about belonging in transition studies, we also talked about other ways of belonging and also not belonging. And this was actually the topic of Jonas's blog post on medium.com, which has inspired this entire conversation that I had with him. Jonas was generous to share with me also about his professional journey into transition studies and the adjacent transformation studies. So an all-round rich discussion, which I invite you very much to enjoy. And apologies that in the actual interview I talk a bit quick in this one. I promise I will improve next time. Please enjoy. Great, so I'm here with Jonas Torrens, assistant professor in transition studies, right, from Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. It's very nice to have you. And our meeting was triggered by your reflexive and very kind of introspective piece on medium.com. So I thought it would be very cool to have a chat. Also, maybe we could start with that, because you're in both transitions and transformations in those two adjacent fields. Could you maybe say a few things about transformations as a field?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Zahar, for having me. It's a pleasure, and it's really nice to have a chat with you again after working together for a period. I think many people in our area have come across these two terms, and there's been quite a few papers published about the differences between transitions and transformations. And I don't think I can give a comprehensive response to kind of core differences, but one of the key differences, if you want, is how do you perceive the kind of core scope of change that is happening. So transition studies tends to assume that the kind of focus for change is at the level of social technical systems and the institutional regimes that help guide their development, particularly related to, of course, the multi-level perspective that is familiar to many people. And so there is a kind of tendency to frame the issues around sustainability as persistent issues in particular societal systems like energy provision, water provision, and so forth. And that focus comes with certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and of course we can see by the variety and depth of the research that there is a lot to do and to say about these more sectoral or social technical systems transitions. However, the field of transformations opens up the possibility and discusses the possibility that the depth at which the change is happening and has to happen in society to address sustainability, that it could be happening at the level of other functions or other aspects of society. So things like values, things like fundamental relationships between how society and nature, or things such as patriarchy or colonialism and so forth. And so there is an attention to some of these deeper structures, if you want, that are structuring a variety of systems, that are structuring a variety of relationships in society. I always found it useful to kind of situate myself a little bit at the interface between them. And one example of that has been working together with colleagues at the Urban Transitions and Transformations thematic group at the Sustainability Transitions Research Network. I do feel that the differences between the fields can be sometimes overstated, and there's nowadays quite a lot of cross-pollination, and people are interested in drawing from both of these approaches to systemic change, to think a little bit more deeply about what needs to change and how deeply. A good example of that is, for example, Deep Transitions, as some of you may know, that is talking about these changes that affect a variety of social technical systems at once. And that comes closer to some of these conversations about transformations, for example. But these terms, as anything in academia, are used quite loosely, so it's important not to overstate and to be really curious about how a particular study is framing and approaching the question of conceptualizing systemic change.
Mm-hmm. And now in your work, you are in the same way engaging with both?
I would say so. I do tend to attend mostly the conferences related to the Sustainability Transitions Research Network still, but for many years I have been reading of authors that publish primarily in conferences such as the Earth System Governance or the Transformations Conference. So there is slightly different meetings and places where these conversations are happening. And there is quite a few researchers that are aware of the kind of richness of both traditions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then when we now continue to talk about transitions and transformations as a field, we can assume that they are more or less talking about the same processes.
I wouldn't necessarily say that they're the same, but there are certainly two academic communities that have some overlap. They have certain kind of shared interests. They have different ways of going about those interests. So if you think in terms of shared interest on systemic change, but the methodologies, the approaches, the levels of analysis are quite different, and the theoretical frameworks that are used, for example, tend to be quite different. But I'm always found the dialogue between them to be much richer, and I think it's a pity to really try and keep them as very separate, but I don't think it's just a question of trying to merge them either. It's about a kind of productive dialogue between these different ways of seeing.
Yeah, but so both of these are interdisciplinary, right?
Absolutely. Transdisciplinary, you could say.
Transdisciplinary, yeah. And coming back to your piece on medium.com, you were talking a lot about values and a feeling of belonging and cosmopolitan values, and I wonder how many. Well, of course, it relates a lot with when you're a transition scholar, transformation scholar. It makes sense that you also adopt you are such a scholar because you have you value these more sort of cosmopolitan values, as opposed to the recent sort of trajectory, as we have seen in the recent Dutch elections, a bit of going looking introspectively nationally. So I wonder the connection between cosmopolitan values and research, and have they been particularly useful in one way or another in some disciplines as opposed to other disciplines?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I think perhaps to situate a little bit of conversation, cosmopolitanism has a very long history philosophically, and I'm not a philosopher nor a historian, but I think it's important to engage with it with this sort of general idea of the possibility of thinking about citizenship and belonging as belonging to kind of a wider unit, like the cosmos, for example. So cosmopolitan, so a citizen of the cosmos. And it sounds a little fanciful, but it departs from a deep recognition of the ways in which humans of all kinds share concerns, share certain, if you want, the human condition or issues around how to be human that touch on people from all sorts of nationalities and places. And it's almost a call for an attention and solidarity to a wider way of being human that is not subdivided and so concerned with the divisions that have emerged historically, for example, around the 18th century in many places, or around the 1500s, as was the case of Brazil. So this idea that rather than overemphasizing the diversity and the separateness of different peoples in different places of the world, that there is a possibility of thinking of humanity more collectively. In the context of sustainability, it's important to marry that with, and I've been just recently kind of engaging a little bit more with ideas that pay attention to the ways in which modernity has been emerging as almost as a kind of overriding attempt to create this universalizing ideas of what it is to be human, what it is to be rational, what it is to be engaged in economy and so forth. So a lot of the sustainability concerns that we have, that we share, they speak to the need of challenging some of these universalizing ideas. And so cosmopolitanism in the context of sustainability, it's important to not see it as just this, we're all the same and therefore like erasing of differences, but it's more of like a deep tolerance to differences and a deep engagement with those different ways of seeing and the richness that they bring. So I find this particularly interesting because for me the kind of closest that I've come to articulate that for myself is around the idea of ontological multiplicity. Because someone that has lived in many different places, I have come to see very different ways of being in the world that are, historically and societally constructed. And so to recognize that we're not just one and the same, we're not homogeneous, but yet that there is a possibility of a shared belonging, a shared concern around constructing sort of a decent life for everyone, for example. So ideas that come from scholars such as Arturo Escobar around the pluriverse and others speak to the need to decolonize and challenge some of the universalizing language that is prevalent in modernity and modernist thinking. And when it comes to sustainability, it's quite important, and scholars like Andy Sterling that have published both on transitions and transformations have done a lot to talk about the need for emphasizing plurality, for emphasizing difference, and for thinking about the processes by which we come together as different, and are able to explore and articulate what different criteria for what is or not sustainable, different ideas of progress, different ideas of benefit, rather than assuming that we know what progress is and it's just about getting people on board, or assuming that each country will just decide by itself what progress is and then go about it. So there's a sort of recognition of the shared plurality and the search for kind of a bigger canvas on which to look at these questions. Feel free to unpack any of that.
Yeah, good luck with that. Maybe I will approach it from a bit of an angle, from a more of a personal angle, because so you because of your piece as well. Interdisciplinary, so and transdisciplinary scholarship. Have you yourself always been an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary scholar?
Yeah, I think my interest in inter and transdisciplinarity is in part a kind of outcome of my upbringing, to be honest, because I grew up in a household with a sociologist masters who ended up doing his PhD at the same time as me, and a historian mom. And I was very interested in technology. So there was a kind of clear recognition from early on that there was a possibility of thinking about dialoguing across different ways of knowing and different, academic communities, for example. And I can attribute to my mom a kind of deep interest into that as she was coordinating like a high school pedagogics and thinking a lot about how to implement some of that at the school environment. So things around, the writings of Friedrich Capra and others. So this understanding, for example, of the potential of concepts around complexity, for example, being integrators that allow for different disciplines to find themselves in dialogue. And I'm also, I've studied engineering at first, of all things, because I wanted to have these practical contributions to, the environmental challenges we had, and I thought that technology was the best way to do that. And in many of these areas, engineering, for example, it's impossible to not think about some degree of interdisciplinarity. There are things that comes from physics, there are things that comes from chemistry. The natural sciences don't stay separate in the world. Like the phenomena don't respect the separation of the sciences, right? And so this recognition of there being spaces where these different things need to come together has always been there. And as I developed and followed my academic career, my interest shifted over time and led me more and more into spaces of, if you want, inter and transdisciplinary integration, where there was an attempt of mobilizing knowledges from different academic communities to respond to specific societal challenges. So the inter and transdisciplinarity was not a concern in and of itself, but it was more a response to the object of interest that I had. So because I was interested in sustainability, I couldn't but try to learn from different things. And around the time of my master's, I was working at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm. And I was very lucky to work with Dr. Sarah Cornell, who was an interdisciplinarian and a very polymathic one in that sense, who was deeply steeped in questions of both natural sciences and social sciences. And who had done quite a lot of reading and work on philosophy of sciences, and that sort of rubbed off a little, in that I became interested in things like critical realism and other theories around that time. So I think it's a sort of serendipitous encounter with it, more than being interested just because. And I see sometimes, I have this question of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity for what? Is it just an academic exercise of coming together, or there is a kind of purpose? And both of those ways of thinking about research speak to the need for doing interdisciplinary research or transdisciplinary research as a sort of recognition of the complexity of the world, right? The world is complex, and that demands different perspectives to come together. And I think that sort of more pragmatic way of approaching it is something that I find really useful.
So you feel, in a way, there's a theme of being in between geographically, but for you, but also because you come from Brazil, right? And also between the quote-unquote disciplines, or across them, trans. I can imagine that a lot of transition studies PhDs could not be comfortable with the high sort of the lack of clear disciplinary silos that they expect they see from other fields and the more established, larger fields. What would be maybe your advice for those people?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is this issue of how do we explore this sort of open-ended transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary context without losing oneself. And I don't think I had a very sophisticated account of how to do that when I first started my PhD, and I had to grapple a little bit with reading all sorts of research fields and finding which influences felt most resonant or like which ones most spoke to the issues that I was working with. So at first I think I got lost, but in getting lost, sometimes you find really important things. And I was lucky to do a PhD at the Science Policy Research Unit, which is an environment, like they would describe themselves as a broad tent where, a variety of disciplines and backgrounds come together, and most people have very serendipitous ways of arriving at that place at the University of Sussex in Brighton. And so I was lucky to be in an environment that encouraged, to some extent, that sort of autonomy to explore and to find oneself within different academic communities and not have to over-identify upfront with any one particular community. So not say, I am an economist, therefore I only think in economic terms, but to have a more sort of curiosity-driven or purpose-driven engagement. So you engage with the literatures that speak to your problem. So I was very lucky to be in a place that encouraged that sort of problem-driven way of engaging with research. Nowadays, I'm currently teaching a course on interdisciplinary competences called SPARK, and we base ourselves and frame a lot of the activities around a set of competences that have been developed by Utrecht University around basically competences for interdisciplinary research. And we focus on 4 of them that I think would be useful for anyone starting a PhD to be familiar with. First of all is this idea of disciplinary grounding. So it's not necessarily to kind of start not having any knowledge, right? We often come from a particular tradition, and we come from a certain way of understanding the world, and it's important that we become aware of what that tradition is, what are some of the assumptions, what are some of the specificities of that way of knowing, right? By the time you're starting a PhD, you've already done a master's, you've already done quite a lot of reading and researching. So disciplinary grounding helps one be aware of where they're coming from, but also what is there, like what can they draw from, right? So it's very problematic, for example, from someone that is in transition studies that is not familiar with the strands of literature that contributed, that built up transition studies, that made transition studies what it is today. So disciplinary grounding would be almost an invitation to kind of go into that deeper intellectual history to understand where things are coming from. And then second, we have this idea of perspective taking. So the ability of recognizing how different actors or different academic communities perceive a certain issue, right? So that you can engage with a variety of perspectives, not trying to merge them immediately, but trying to see the distinctions. We often use this metaphor of lenses to talk about academic research, right? Like there is a lens, and that shows certain issues, doesn't show others. And so that perspective taking helps one survey, if you want, or if you're working on a project, you often get different people representing different perspectives. But that allows one to get a little deeper into the perspectives that are contributing to an issue. After, if you develop that, you can also start thinking about this finding common ground. And finding common ground doesn't mean, again, a merger of or a sort of a summation of all the things that have been found. Some of the common ground might be around the need to reframe an issue so that there is common ground, or by working in sort of iteratively and trying to be reflexive about the different perspectives that are present, you can start to find some space of shared interest or of shared methodologies, for example. And the fourth, the interdisciplinary competence that we work on in that course is around integration. So knowledge integration is, if you want, is a bit the holy grail of interdisciplinary research. You're trying to integrate knowledge from different disciplines, but it takes quite a while to get there. And I think too often people sort of skip the other competences and they try to go directly to knowledge integration. I for certain have been guilty of that in the past. So I think there are materials like that speak a little bit about the prerequisites that one should develop to get to the point that they feel comfortable doing interdisciplinary research. And of course, this tool from Utrecht is one of many. There are entire websites and platforms dedicated to knowledge integration, and there is proposals of that. Knowledge integration itself should become a discipline, and people could kind of become educated in being integrators or implementers and so forth. So there is a really rich tradition of thinking about those competences and spaces and what is necessary to do. I do find, I think perhaps a difficulty in some of the interdisciplinary settings that we're in is that it's almost taken for granted that we know how to do interdisciplinarity, that we know how to do transdisciplinarity, and there isn't as much attention to the training in the process, in the sensibilities, if you want, that you need to operate in that space, as you would have for a more traditional discipline. And I think that is a major loss. But I also see signs of that changing. For example, in the NEST network, there is now a PhD school that also offers quite a lot of preparation in terms of thinking more seriously about methodology, integration, and so forth.
And now I want to go back to your piece, because you asked a lot of key questions. So maybe I can throw some of them back to you. A few that really caught my eye. So, for example, you have these reflexive questions that people should ask themselves. How may we resignify belonging more inclusively and less territorially or defensively? What if we looked at the various sedimentary and reactive interactions, meanings and bonds that burst forth when we participate with others instead of extending and deepening roots into the land?
Yeah, so to just take a little step back that might help ground this conversation. Part of what I was trying to do in this piece is to open up a different set of questions that we can use to reflect and live with around belonging. And the reason for that is that I think we're saturated about conversations of belonging, but they're often a little binary and a little limiting, in that we often talk about, do you belong here or not? Where do you belong? Where is your home? Where do you come from? And these questions, they all have embedded in them a very strong territoriality. They have an assumption that there is a place somewhere that you belong to, and if you don't, you should find that place somehow, and you should go back. You should go back to your place. You should go back home if you happen to be a foreigner in a place that is becoming less friendly to foreigners. But I was trying to create a little bit more spaciousness and recognize that belonging is a kind of deep human concern. And I'm not original in saying that. It's one of the biggest concerns in psychology. People talk a lot about it. But that we find very different ways of articulating for ourselves, or of making it work, of constructing a sense of belonging. And in recognizing that there are different ways of going about it, could it be that there's also possibilities that are more inclusive than others, that are more less dependent on things that only the privileged would have, for example, right? So to give the example of go back home, it assumes that everyone has this home waiting for them somewhere that has been really safe and loving for them. I happen to have loving parents that would welcome me home if I were to go back to their place, but that is very specific to my story, but it's not something that is widely available for many people. So when we start having these societal conversations around belonging, but that they embed certain notions that are very constrictive about what is possible and what is real belonging, we exclude by definition. And I was trying to give myself, in a way, authorization to be more, to hold some of these ideas about belonging less tightly, and to try and think of other ways that I might belong, that I might already belong. Something I noticed recently, and I've been doing some work with that, is that oftentimes when we think of ourselves in ways that are about improving, like I want to improve how I belong here, what we inadvertently do is that we increase our sense of deficiency, our sense of everything that is lacking, all the things that I don't have here. So I could do that about living in the Netherlands, and I would recognize, well, my Dutch is not as great, and I don't have a passport, and I don't have this, and I don't have that. And I would end that conversation feeling despondent, feeling unable to be present, to connect. I would be feeling more alienated than from the onset. And instead, I think there is a richness of thinking about these other possibilities. In what ways could I belong here? Or how might I construct my belonging in this place? And that is a slightly different angle into the question, but that creates all sorts of different affordances, different possibilities for ourselves, but also for others, right? So if we see belonging as something that is more proactively constructed, that is about how I relate to others, it means that we can start helping others belong, and in doing that, we will find ourselves being a part of a meaningful community and so forth.
Yeah, I think you would expect from a post-modernist point of view that people would embrace the idea of everything is of social constructedness, of especially your identity. But then there's this idea of belonging to a land. This really strongly is pervasive for some reason.
Yeah, of course, and I think if we were to look back at the history of humanity, we're living in a very specific moment in time where the possibilities for someone to construct a life like I did, living in 8 different cities in the past 15 years and so forth, there is a kind of a certain degree. It's not entirely novel, but there is a certain degree of novelty of just how many people can access that. But even then, if we were to look back, and I try to do that in the piece, is like humans didn't get to occupy all different continents and whatnot by just staying home. So there is a history of migration that is also part of our humanity, right? And the same with coming from a Latin American country. This is very obvious. Like you would sit in the classroom, and every surname comes from a different place. So you would in my high school, you would have everything from Ukrainian, Polish, deeply Brazilian. My surname is Belgian. There is a diversity that is already present. So when we take seriously to look at how these things are constructed in different places by different people, you see that there is a lot more variety. I did receive a comment I thought was very thoughtful in LinkedIn about someone who had a different experience than mine, who had grown up their entire life in sort of 20 miles away from where they were born and things like that. And it was interesting because they were discussing the kind of the pros and cons or the gains and the pains of having that way of belonging. And you could notice that it wasn't pain-free. There was some certain difficulties. For example, kind of a longing for the freedom of being able to reinvent yourself somewhere else, which is something that I've exercised excessively, right? So, but it's to recognize that there is these different ways, and that there isn't just the right way that everyone should be doing it. Unless you have exactly that, you're kind of somehow a broken human being, because I think that is really problematic, especially at the time where we start, where there is a kind of whiff of xenophobia around in the air, right? So if the people that really belong are only the ones that have a strong connection to the land, well, you go down the line of that argument and you see some pretty nasty ideas coming up, right? Of thinking that is the only right way, that those that are not are invaders of somehow. The moment and that's something I touch as well in the piece, is that belonging also has the connotation of possession, right? So when you think about home, where is my home? This home belongs to me. If you want to belong there too, do we enter into conflict? So that's what I mean by thinking about some other ways of approaching the question of belonging that are not premised on those solely on those metaphors and ways of thinking, right? And I see more and more belonging as quite distributed in the sense that you probably belong to an academic community, or you belong to, a place or a history or a family, and your partner might have a different sort of way of thinking about their belonging. That I find it as a richer and more granular discussion.
Yeah, you use the metaphor of nesting birds versus old-grown trees, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've been working on a project. It's a small seed-funded project that explores the role of metaphors in helping us think about collaborations. And for me, the key takeaway from this project has been just recognizing the power of playing with a variety of metaphors, not taking for granted that we should choose one and be like, this is the metaphor, right? Like, where do you have roots? Like, if you have roots, it suggests that they're fixed. It suggests that they are, they grow slowly. It suggests that they require like soil and so forth. So if you juxtapose that metaphor with another metaphor, like, a nest for a bird, you end up getting a different sense. Like, where do I feel comfortable? Where is it safe? It's less about the fixity to the land, and it's more about the safety, the protection, the place from which I can, grow my offspring, for example.
So what to do with this for yourself, with this realization?
Yeah, so I think I would suggest to become curious and sensitive to some of the ways we, to use a fancy term, like, are languaging these things, right? Like, we are imposing a certain language and a certain set of metaphors or assumptions, and oftentimes we stop at that level and we don't excavate a little bit what is underneath, right? So, do you belong or not? Like, oh wait, what do we mean by belonging? And if we think about it, do we carry, like, what are we bringing into this conversation, and what does that do to the thing we're trying to talk about? It's the same, in a way, is a similar issue to what we started with, like transitions, transformations. Do you just choose them randomly? No, like, you need to be attentive where this is coming from, and that, if you want, the bottom line is a very old phrase, but it's this idea of, like, what does it mean to live an examined life, right? What does it mean to examine the terms and the ways we think about our life, a little philosophically, but also in terms of practices, right? Like, if I think of belonging as X, Y, and Z, what does that do for how I practice my day-to-day, how I practice my participation in different communities? Someone that believes belonging is all about a home and a land might be the kind of person that wants to buy a farm and, move to the rural, to kind of reconstruct an idealized version of belonging. But what happens if they get there and they find themselves miserable, right? What happens if that assumption that this is how I belong doesn't quite pan out? So it's a kind of more ongoing process of playing with, living, trying different things. And that's why I emphasize, rather than trying to answer these questions in a definitive way, what it would be like to treat some of these questions as sort of lingering, like to live with these questions, to stay with them in such a way that one day we might feel like, oh, I found this question. And I think that most academic research has an element of that. So it's not surprising that I'm writing this piece, because in academia we are often trying to formulate questions for which we don't have answers, and it's a pity if we're only asking very obvious research questions, right? Like, we're trying, almost like grasping with some questions that are a little more ineffable, a little more difficult to pin down.
another question that you had. What if resignifying belonging goes hand in hand with mobilizing either evolutionary efforts or revolutionary efforts? And what if our fiction and imagination shifted from science to kinship? So this idea of kinship, and you talk about kinfi.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I'm part of a book club that reads a lot of sci-fi, cli-fi, and speculative fiction.
Cli-fi is
Climate fiction, yeah. And we meet about once a month, and it's been a really joyous ride. And I think a lot of the pieces that we read together spoke to a need to rethink not only the technologies or the institutional setup of society, but actually the ways people relate. And there is a long tradition in that, so I don't think it's necessarily, it's not that this idea is entirely novel. I think is more to draw attention to the ways in which we might need novel ways of relating. And a lot of novels have that element. Just over Christmas, I was reading a novel called Hopeland, which I highly recommend. And it's a beautiful, sort of fantastic climate-informed novel. But so much of the book's kind of key interests are about how people relate, and how those relations create the possibility of responding better to climate change. So I think that interest on the nitty-gritty of the social, the relating, is something that is really important, and is perhaps missing in a lot of the conversations about traditional innovation, traditional, even transition studies. If you think about, for example, social innovation, there is a lot more emphasis on new ways of being and organizing that open up. So there are academic communities that are already more attuned to some of these questions, but I think in personal terms, we can find ways of belonging that, like, if we treat belonging not as a given, like this is how it works, but as a question that we're living, that we're trying to grapple with. There might be ways of orienting ourselves that create different possibilities with people. For example, I do think it's a task for men of our age to think about how do we relate to our partners in non-patriarchal ways, right? And how does that help us belong in that relationship? Or to think of, like, what is our role as men in child rearing, and how do we create relationships of care that are not just, handing the baby over to the mother so we go back to academic work. Like, these questions, they're deeply rewarding in terms of belonging, to engage with them, but also they have some of the elements of the kinds of changes that we're talking about in society that are necessary. So there's a kind of a praxis of the everyday, like a way of embodying in the day-to-day some of these academic questions that we're finding. And I've become, over this recent period, very interested in that interface, right? Of what does it mean to live in a way that is more conducive to not only sustainability, but others belonging to, and so forth.
Yeah, I did note several of the novels that you recommended, so
Yes.
Good, thank you for that. Maybe going closer to the conclusion, I want to ask you. You mentioned you're a member of a book club. In your non-academic writing, what are the themes that you are exploring, and do they align with your academic writing?
Yeah, so both these pieces that we've been discussing on belonging and identity, it almost felt like I couldn't not write them. So it wasn't like a decision, it wasn't so, especially the first, it just felt like it was coming out of me, and I had to just let it go. Like
the first one was on belonging,
on
the
belonging.
second one on identity.
Second on identity. The one on identities, I felt I was writing a little bit more because I had raised some questions, and it felt like it made sense. It was a more rational decision to write it. Well, the first one, it felt really more like a deep expression that I just had to get it out. And so they have a different tenor, I think, from academic practice in that there is still like this professional concern, like there is a peer reviews, like this was published intentionally in a non-academic environment so that I could get kind of conversations going, and that was the most rewarding part of it. Funnily enough, I did share with a colleague, and Tim, if you're hearing it, who was wearing his academic hat when he read it, and so he was criticizing in a way the lack of precision or the lack of like, what is this, like, what are you trying to say? And it was interesting because he reread the piece a little later without that academic hat, and he realized in a way like, oh, this is what he was trying to do. He wasn't trying to give answers or to tell us how to feel about something, and I think that is perhaps something that I wish I had known before, is that doing this kind of non-academic writing creates a space to think differently in ways that can be really enriching in their own right. Not because they're going to be instrumental or because they are going to be like a way to test ideas and then you're going to use them. The non-instrumentality of it is really endearing. Like doing that work feels energizing. You can hear it in my voice, even if it's failing. And I think academia sometimes can feel very dry. If all the words that you write are going to be seen by a peer reviewer and are going to be scrutinized and so on and so forth, that conditions our thinking a little bit. I find it really intriguing, for example, the very word discipline that we've been kind of going around. There is a little phrase from a book about interdisciplinarity that talks disciplines discipline disciples, right? So
disciplines the disciples.
Yeah, so it's about the disciplining work that they do, and I think the academic writing is a key space in which that disciplining happens. So can we find ways to have other spaces of more undisciplined thought that allow us for more creativity and synthesis and generativity, that are not obeying the same standards? I have a good friend, for example, from a colleague, Jos Vervoort, who has been writing a beautiful series of blogs that are super intriguing, and they have gradually been changing how he perceives his own work because he had the space to articulate it, right? Like if writing is thinking, writing academically is just one way of thinking, and writing non-academically might be a very complementary or inherently necessary form of self-expression.
Yeah, so in my first career I was a written press journalist, so working on economics and so on. But definitely I had to joining academia was a really indeed a disciplining experience to learn the writing style, and it's really formulaic, as you said, or maybe you didn't, but it is. It does serve its purpose, because everything is expected so in the places where you expect when you read a standard paper, a publication, and it's not. It's different in other points, in other styles, so non-academic styles. And I think you mentioned at one point, with maybe a different conversation we had, evocative academic writing is something that is.
It's indeed. Again, it's another thing that differs by academic community or discipline. But I do find in innovation studies and transition studies there is almost a very formulaic style that has become standard. It is on the one hand helpful for certain things. You know where to find things in a paper. You know how what is being said and what not. But I think there's also something lost in not letting the author elaborate more and specify and try different words and be more experimental with their thinking. It's almost as if you're only writing the things that you're absolutely certain about. But oftentimes the gray areas, the areas that we're kind of a little uncertain about, might be the ones that are most significant for other academics, right? And even in terms of editorials, in terms of there isn't much flavor, there isn't much color to how academic writing in transition studies is currently done. You know, I'm guilty of that. As I was doing my PhD, I didn't quite know how to do that either, and it's kind of a practice that takes much longer. It's also a very international environment where many of us are learning English as we go, and having to find ways to make the language work for their purpose. So I'm not surprised that that's the case, but I do think there is a loss, and I think other areas have a little bit more of that flavor, of the flair, color in their writing. If you think about STS, for example, there's a lot of that. So there is other possibilities in different fields, and I don't think there's been a kind of reflection on transition studies about what it does to write so dryly. If you follow other authors that are writing about environmental issues, they often are able to write pieces that are deeply moving. Like you read them and it's hard not to feel moved by them. And they end up having considerable impact in the societal conversation as a result, because they're moving people. Their pieces have a quality to them. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be, grounded in evidence, or they shouldn't be thoughtful and all the quality criteria of academic thinking. But we almost threw the baby with the bathwater when it comes to style, in a sense.
Can you recall any names of the authors who are?
I think a good example of authors that write, whose writing is quite distinctive. I mentioned Andy Sterling, and his articles are not ones that you would read quickly. They require a lot of work, but there is a depth of precision and insight in the choices of the language itself that go into writing that add entire new dimensions to the work, that change how you perceive the world, because the writing is so evocative. And I think, it's not for everyone's taste, but that for me is a very good example of someone who writes beautifully. And there is another researcher that I find always very inspiring. She works more on design, but she worked a lot on infrastructures and urban transitions and whatnot. Her name is Shannon Mattern, and her writing is also deeply thoughtful and exploratory, and it's not just writing in a traditional journal style. I wish we had much more essays published on transitions, right? Like it's almost like the editing industry, the academic publishing industry has eaten academia. It's like all the other forms of academic expression are no longer valid because they don't count. And it's a pity that we don't have more essays, that we don't have more other forms of academic expression that cover that. Shannon Mattern is a great example of more essay-like contributions that are super grounded in a depth of thinking, but we do that differently.
Especially in sustainability transitions, where it is very much I think a lot of people who are in sustainability transitions are motivated by environmentalism and ideas of protecting nature and so on. But you don't really see. You only see the dryness of it in the standard papers. How have you been dealing with that? Do you keep it dry, or do you?
I think in my PhD, I was very concerned with fitting in, and I think in that way I probably repeated some of that
like everybody probably in PhD.
Yeah, and it's I think it as a supervisor nowadays, I would be more encouraging of my students trying to develop and find their voice as an author.
So voice is one.
Yeah, that could be one way to think about it. Oftentimes we still see master students that are writing master theses, and they've heard for the longest time that they're not allowed to use first person in their writing, even though they're writing pieces that are about reflexivity, that have a kind of a very specific, situated, observational sort of standpoint. So why not sort of train our students already to be able to discuss their positionality more clearly and so forth. So I think there's a lot to be done in that space. I'm not sure I'm necessarily the one to lead that charge. I'm not by any means a academic, literary genius in that sense. But there's some definitely scope for change. Because of the topics we touched on, I just wanted to highlight this idea that it's very easy for someone, for example, in a PhD position, to feel very at odds and feel like an outsider, feel like they don't belong in academic circles, or they don't belong to a particular discipline because they come from a different background and so forth. And one thing that I've come to realize a long time ago is just how widespread that feeling is. So that the reason me and other friends came together to kind of co-create the beginnings of PhDs and transitions that then became the NEST network for early career researchers was because there was this recognition that we all felt a bit out of place. We all felt like there wasn't. So the more we're able to voice and to name that sense of awkwardness or out of placeness or whatever you want to call it, this unbelonging, the more we're able to find others that are in a similar situation and that we can kind of reach out to. And there is no reason, sometimes there is almost an assumption that in order to accomplish a PhD, you need to suffer in the way that people before you have suffered, and unless you suffer the same way or more, you're not allowed in to the temple of academia or something like that. And I think it's a pity that we don't challenge that more often. So perhaps for other young or early career researchers there, to not take for granted this unbelonging, to not just accept that this is it, and you just need to bite the bitter pill and keep on going, or bite your upper lip, as they would say it in the UK. But there is a possibility of reaching out, finding others, finding groups that you feel deeply belonging with. Sometimes they might be in academia, and other times they will be outside, like a book club, for example. And I think that isolation, the feeling of alienation that can come with this issue I'm describing, is perhaps a main reason why a lot of students and researchers find that they are unable to finish a PhD, because they've internalized that in order to do a PhD they need to isolate themselves, and in doing so they find themselves depressed, unwell, and so forth. So perhaps there is a potential to challenge a little bit that sort of internalizing of the need to suffer in a very specific way. You don't get better grades in your defense if you suffered more than other people.
So this, I guess, what you can do in a NEST. This is what you can get trained, or at least exposed to these kind of failures.
Yes, things like going to conferences, participating in a place like NEST, or organizing things, creating spaces for others, being part of a reading club, writing together with others. I recently, with friends, created something like it started as a coaching circle where we would just meet from time to time. Every month we would meet for an hour, and we would sort of see how everyone was doing, two other friends in the same field. And we would support each other. And we ended up writing a paper together because the ideas that we were discussing were just fascinating for everyone that was part of it. But it didn't start as a paper, and it didn't end as a paper. The paper was a natural outcome of the conversations that were happening. So there was this rich sort of friendship brewing in parallel to work that was supporting the work, that was making the work more meaningful, deeper, and so forth. Relating has unintended consequences, some of which can be papers, I think it's a pity that we still have a lot of structures in academia that emphasize the idea that you need to go at it alone. Unless you go at it alone, it's not valid. And so there is definitely many ways that people can find meaningful connections and to see them as potentially conducive to the work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonas.
Thank
We've
you.
covered a lot of things, but mainly we stayed around the topic of belonging in academia, in transitions, in the country that you're in, and how to do that in the group that you work in. So thank you so much for coming. Let's hope you come again sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Good luck with the podcast. I hope it will blow up.